Although Shinran's interpretation of Pure Land Buddhism was epoch-making, he often said that his own acceptance of the Pure Land teachings was nothing more than the teachings which were handed down to him by his predecessors, whom he called the Seven Patriarchs. For Shinran, the teachings of Shakyamuni and the Seven Patriarchs are the manifestation of Amida's compassionate vow. Shinran's selection of the seven masters is traditionally attributed to the following. 1. Each of the seven patriarchs was himself an aspirant for birth in the Pure Land. 2. Each left writings on the Nembutsu teaching. And 3. Each of their interpretations is distinguished and essential in the history of the deliverance of the Nembutsu. The seven patriarchs eulogized by Shinran are, number 1, Nagarjuna of India, circa 2nd to 3rd century A.D. Nagarjuna's work is grounded in the fundamental Buddhist concept of interdependent origination, according to which all beings are seen as existing only in interrelation with all other phenomenal things, and thus to be utterly without permanent characteristics or individual reality. The work of Nagarjuna, which is most often cited in connection with Pure Land Buddhism, is the chapter on easy practice in his commentary on the 10 Bodhisattva stages. In the easy path, one calls the names of the Buddhas, practicing a denial of attachment to self through reliance upon the compassion of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and through desire for birth in a realm of purity, where all defiled karma of attachment is transformed into corresponding good through the operation of emptiness. Included in this path are the name and the vow of Amida Buddha. In the second portion of Shinran's hymn on the Nembutsu and True Shinjin, which is a series of verses within his Passages on the Pure Land Way, Shinran speaks of the contribution of each of the seven patriarchs to his true Pure Land teaching. And in the case of Nagarjuna, Shinran writes, Sakyamuni Tathagata on Mount Lanka prophesied to the multitudes that in South India, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna would appear in this world to crush the views of being and non-being. Proclaiming the unexcelled Mahayana teaching, he would attain the stage of joy and be born in the land of happiness. Bodhisattva Nagarjuna would appear in this world to crush the one-sided views of being and non-being. Proclaiming the unexcelled Mahayana teaching, he would attain the stage of joy and be born in the land of happiness. Nagarjuna wrote the commentary on the 10 Bodhisattva stages, and particularly sorrowing for those on the steep trails of difficult practice, therein reveals for all the great way of easy attainment. With the mind of reverence, one should keep and say the name and quickly attain the stage of non-retrogression. When Shinjin is pure, one immediately sees the Buddha. So here, as do the proponents of various schools of Buddhism, Shinran is tying his teaching back to the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni, and talking about the fact that he prophesied that Bodhisattva Nagarjuna would appear in this world. Why? To crush the views of being and non-being. This is really the essence of Mahayana Buddhism, great vehicle Buddhism, in the context of the teaching of sunyata, or emptiness. And this is what Nagarjuna, as a philosopher and Buddhist adherent, did, basically, in his writings, was he said that reality cannot be described by any affirmative attributes, nor can it be defined by any negation of attributes. So any kind of assertion of the existence of beings or the non-existence of beings is a false philosophy and not consistent with the ultimate truth. So he crushed these views of being and non-being and, touted the Mahayana teaching, which Shinran, again, wants to make clear that his teaching, even though on the surface it appears divergent from the traditional Buddhist beliefs and practices, is very much rooted in the great vehicle teachings, the Mahayana teachings of Buddhism. And as Nagarjuna attains the stage of joy, we recognize that as the first stage in the Bodhisattva path, in the context of the Bodhisattva practicing the paramitas, with the first one being dana, D-A-N-A, or generosity or charity. And this is the stimulus, the aspiration for enlightenment, and the beginning of the practice of the Bodhisattva path that stimulates this feeling of great joy. And then finally, I'll mention here that Shinran articulates the fact that Nagarjuna realized that it is very difficult to accomplish enlightenment through rigorous practices of meditation, morality, etc. And so he recognized that there is actually an easy path toward fulfillment and attainment of Buddhahood, and that would be the path of reliance upon the name, which is the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, and that this is a way, as Shinran articulates it, that the individual can quickly attain what? Not Buddhahood immediately, but attain the stage of non-retrogression. In other words, never going back, and can look forward to seeing the Buddha in this life in the sense of appreciating the comfort provided by imagining the various cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but also then, as Shinran would put it, attaining Buddhahood at the time of our death.
The second patriarch was Vasubandhu of India, circa 4th century AD. Vasubandhu was one of the founders of the Yogacara school. His contribution to Pure Land Buddhism lies chiefly in his formulation of a Nembutsu, or thinking on the Buddha, practice by adopting the methodology of contemplation on Pure Land teachings. In his Treatise on the Pure Land, Vasubandhu professes single-hearted faith in Amida and teaches the 5 contemplative gates as a practical method by which one can attain birth in Amida's Pure Land. The 5 gates are worship of Amida, praise of Amida, aspiration for birth in the Pure Land, contemplation on the Pure Land, and merit transference to save all sentient beings.
So Shinran's verses on this second patriarch are as follows. Bodhisattva Vasubandhu declares in a treatise that, relying on the sutras, he will reveal the true and real virtues, casting light on the universal primal vow by which we leap crosswise beyond birth and death. He expounds this vow that surpasses conception. He discloses the mind that is single, so that we, fettered by blind passions, be saved by Amida's directing of virtue through the power of the primal vow. When persons turn and enter the great treasure ocean of virtue, necessarily they join the Tathagata's great assemblage. And when they have reached that lotus-held world, they immediately realize the body of tranquility and equality. Then, sporting in the forests of blind passion, they manifest transcendent powers. Entering the garden of birth and death, they assume various forms to guide others. So there's a lot in this that really reflects, again, Shinran's understanding of the ultimate true teaching of Pure Land Buddhism, and he's utilizing reference to all 7 of these patriarchs to emphasize the points that he wants to put forward as the elements of his own perspective on the spiritual teachings. He references here the fact that Bodhisattva Vasubandhu did focus on the Pure Land Sutras, and emphasizes in particular here the universal primal vow, which you'll recall is the 18th of the 48 vows that Dharmakara Bodhisattva made in the presence of the Buddha Lokesvara Raja, where he basically indicated that he would postpone his own attainment of Buddhahood until and unless he could create a pure land where beings who simply said his name and had faith in him could be reborn when they died. And then for eons he engaged in rigorous, difficult practices to generate enough merit to, in effect, create this pure land, and ultimately he became Amida Buddha, which was the evidence, so to speak, that he was able to accomplish his vow. But at the same time, even though we can view this in a concrete sense, that when I die I'm going to be reborn in the Pure Land, immediately being a Buddha of so-called, quote, body of tranquility and equality, that at the same time he's saying that this vow, quote, surpasses conception. So again, in line with the ideas of Nagarjuna, there's no way we can characterize truth or reality with any human concepts or thoughts or ideas. So then it's a question of what concepts or thoughts or ideas are consistent with the feeling and experience of what resonates within us as we entrust in Amida Buddha. And of course, Shinran is saying that when we do experience this entrusting, we, quote, join the Tathagata's great assemblage. And I think maybe here he's talking actually about Sakyamuni's assemblage that was described in the Lotus Sutra. Many of these references, I think, in Shinran's verses tie back to the Lotus Sutra, which was the key scripture and doctrine within the Tendai school from which not only Shinran but other great medieval Japanese masters evolved and developed their own systems, such as Zen and Nichirenism. So anyhow, this great assemblage on Vulture Peak is characterized in the Lotus Sutra, which again was written after the time of the historical Buddha, but as I said earlier, Buddhist leaders of all traditions have wanted to tie their teachings back to the historical Buddha, and this is one way that perhaps Shinran is doing this in this particular context. The other thing that's very important within this section on Vasubandhu is that he says that when we reach that lotus-held world, in other words, when we're reborn in the Pure Land at the time of death, and realize the body of tranquility and equality, then sporting in the forests of blind passions, they manifest transcendent powers, entering the garden of birth and death, and assume various forms to guide others, so that there is the stage of going to the Pure Land, and then there's the stage also of coming back to this world and expressing the compassionate desire to help beings with their various forms of suffering, which at that point, presumably the Bodhisattva or Buddha is much more capable of doing.
So the third patriarch is Tan Luan of China, who lived from 476 to 542. It is Tan Luan who first gives definition to the fundamental outlook of the popular Pure Land tradition. In his commentary on Vasubandhu's treatise on the Pure Land, Tan Luan reinterprets Vasubandhu's systemization of the Pure Land from the standpoint of emptiness, pointing out that the source of the 29 features of the Pure Land lies in the dual aspects of emptiness, which is the transcendent truth which negates all characteristics, and the potentiality which gives rise to particular forms.
So here are Shinran's verses regarding Tan Luan. Turning toward the dwelling of the great teacher Tan Luan, the ruler Hasio of Liang always paid homage to him as a bodhisattva. Bodhiruchi, master of the Tripitaka, gave Tan Luan the Pure Land teaching, and Tan Luan, burning his scriptures on immortality, took refuge in the land of bliss. In his commentary on the treatise of Bodhisattva Vasubandhu, he reveals the Tathagata's vow at work in our saying of the name. Our going and returning, directed to us by Amida, is based on the primal vow. When Shinjin unfolds in foolish beings, possessed of all blind passions, they immediately attain insight into the non-origination of all existence, and come to realize that birth and death is itself nirvana. Without fail, they reach the land of immeasurable light, and universally guide sentient beings to enlightenment. So here again, as in the previous section, there's an emphasis on the going, namely the going to the Pure Land at the time of death, but also of the returning, and both are directed to us by Amida. They are not, quote, accomplished as a function of our own power or capabilities. These are gifts of grace from Amida Buddha, based on, as it says here, his primal vow, the 18th vow in the larger Sukhavati Sutra. We are identified as foolish beings possessed of all blind passions. And when you really look deeply into yourself, when I look deeply into myself, I may do things or say things that I think are good or well-intentioned, but at a deeper level, most of what we do, if not all of what we do, is contrived and contaminated by baser motivations.
The fourth patriarch within Shin Buddhism was Tao Chou of China, who lived from 562 to 645. Tao Chou, revising Nagarjuna's difficult and easy paths by employing Tan Luan's distinction between self-power and other power, divides the whole of Buddhist teachings into the sacred path and the Pure Land path. The former leads to attainment in this world by one's own power, and the latter to attainment in the Pure Land through other power. He states that no one in the age of the last Dharma can attain enlightenment by means of the sacred path, and that only the Nembutsu of the Pure Land path is practicable. Tao Chou's Nembutsu involves practices of both contemplation and recitation, for what is central to practice is a pure and undistracted mindfulness of Amida.
In Shinran's verses, he says, Tao Chou determined how difficult it is to fulfill the path of sages, and reveals that only passage through the Pure Land gate is possible for us. He criticizes self-power endeavor in the myriad good practices, and encourages us solely to say the fulfilled name embodying true virtue. With kind concern, he teaches the three characteristics of entrusting and non-entrusting, compassionately guiding all identically, whether they live when the Dharma survives as but form, when in its last stage, or when it has become extinct. Though persons have committed evil all their lives, when they encounter the primal vow, they will reach the world of peace and realize the perfect fruit of enlightenment. So here we're getting even further distinctions made between the path of sages and the Pure Land path, and increasingly we're seeing the notion that it's really not only difficult but virtually impossible to attain enlightenment through the path of sages. In other words, to attain Buddhahood in this life. Certainly, for 99% of us, that's the case. So from that standpoint, this is becoming a single practice school, and thus Tao Cho is criticizing, or Shinran is criticizing, self-power as futile. The other thing here is that the primal vow is touted as being sufficiently powerful to overcome all karmic evil, so that even, quote, though persons have committed evil all their lives, when they encounter the primal vow, they will reach the world of peace and realize the fruit of perfect enlightenment. So, just as it says in the Tani Sho, which was a series of teachings by Shinran as communicated to us by his disciple Yenbo, that no evil is so horrendous as to nullify the power of the primal vow to transport the person to the Pure Land when they die if they simply have faith and say the name Namo Amida Butsu.
The fifth patriarch was Shan Tao of China, 613 to 681. It may be that Shan Tao's position in the evolution of practice is of the greatest importance, for he was the first to isolate utterance of the name as the Nembutsu practice prescribed in Amida's vow, thus establishing the superiority of vocal Nembutsu over other Amida-centered practices, such as contemplation, sutra reading, and ritual worship. Shan Tao's famous parable of the White Path has remained a treasured fable explaining, in story fashion, salvation by Amida Buddha in the Pure Land.
And Shinran says, Shan Tao alone, in his time, clarified the Buddha's true intent, and deeply drawing on the primal vow, he established the true teaching. Sorrowing at the plight of meditative and non-meditative practitioners and people of grave evil, he reveals that Amida's light and name are the cause of birth. When one enters this gate leading to nirvana and encounters true mind, without fail one acquires the insights of confidence, joy, and awakening. And attaining the birth that surpasses comprehension, one immediately realizes the eternal bliss of suchness. So here again we're seeing an increasing narrowing of the focus on the name, which is the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, and on a focus on rebirth in the Pure Land. And at the same time, the concomitant proposition that this birth in the Pure Land is not something we can really comprehend in specific conceptual terms, that we can read the sutras and we can see in meditation and we can imagine the adornments within the Pure Land, but in an ultimate sense, we can't fully comprehend. And then in the last sentence, referring to the eternal bliss of suchness, he is referencing really the experience we can have in the here and now of our immediate experience, which is reality.
The sixth patriarch in Shin Buddhism is Gentian of Japan. He lived from 942 to 1017. Gentian is most famous for his work, Collection on the Essentials for Attaining Birth, which exerted great influence on the popular imagination in the Heian period, and became one of the first books to be printed in Japan. His descriptions of the terrors of hell and the wonders of the Pure Land aimed at awakening religious aspirations in Nembutsu practice, and they have great literary force. Gentian like many sages of the Japanese Pure Land tradition, began as a Tendai Buddhist and became devoted to the Nembutsu, or the, quote, calling of the name of Amida Buddha as a sole practice. This was in contrast to the Tendai school, in which the Nembutsu was but one of many practices. Late in life, he founded a small retreat on Mount Hae, the location of the main Tendai monastery, called Yokawa, where he taught sole reliance upon Amida Buddha through the Nembutsu.
Regarding Genshin, Shinran says, Genshin, having broadly elucidated the teachings of Sakyamuni's lifetime, wholeheartedly took refuge in the land of peace and urges all to do so. In accord with the sutras and treatises, he chooses the teaching and practice of birth in the Pure Land. Truly, they are eye and limb for us of this defiled world. Ascertaining the virtue of the single practice and the inadequacy of diversified practice, he leads us to turn and enter the Nembutsu gate, which is true and real. Solely by distinguishing profound and shallow minds of devotion, he sets forth truly the difference between the fulfilled land and the transformed land. So, further narrowing, focus on the Nembutsu as a sole practice. Quote, ascertaining the virtue of the single practice and inadequacy of diversified practice. This is the direction that Pure Land Buddhism is heading in, the giving up of all other meditative and non-meditative practices in favor of the Nembutsu. Also here again we have reference back to Sakyamuni's lifetime, to create that link, to create the thread between Sakyamuni, Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, and all the various patriarchs on up through Shinran himself, who, by the way, did not consider himself the founder of a new school, did not consider himself as having any disciples, quote unquote. He was very humble, as reflected in some of the poems and verses.
And finally, the seventh patriarch of Shin Buddhism, according to Shinran, was Honan, or Genku, of Japan, 1133 to 1212. Within the development of Shin Buddhist teachings, the vital role Honan played centers upon his complete rejection of the possibility of effective self-power practice of any kind, and his sole reliance on other power. In Honan, the unfathomable working of the vow of compassion was brought to life in Japan. When Honan was nearing death, a follower asked him, "Write me something with your own hand, something which you think will be good for me, in order that I may keep it as a memento." The result, the famous one-page testament of Honan, was dictated by him 2 days before he died. And this is Master Honan's one-page testament, dictated in 1212 of the Common Era, quote, "The method of final salvation that I have propounded is neither a sort of meditation, such as has been practiced by many scholars in China and Japan, nor is it a repetition of the Buddha's name by those who have studied and understood the deep meaning of it. It is nothing but the mere repetition of the Namu Amida Butsu, without a doubt of his mercy, whereby one may be born into the land of perfect bliss. The mere repetition with firm faith includes all the practical details, such as the threefold preparation of mind and the 4 practical rules. If I, as an individual, had any doctrine more profound than this, I should miss the mercy of the 2 honorable ones, Amida and Shakyamuni, and be left out of the vow of Amida Buddha. Those who believe this, though they clearly understand all the teachings Shakyamuni taught throughout his whole life, should behave themselves like simple-minded folks who know not a single letter, or like ignorant nuns or monks whose faith is implicitly simple. Thus, without pedantic airs, they should fervently practice the repetition of the name of Amida, and that alone.
And here are Shinran's verses on Honan, who was his immediate teacher. Genku, clearly understanding the sacred scriptures, turned compassionately to foolish people, both good and evil. Establishing in this isolated land the teaching and realization that are the true essence of the Pure Land Way, he transmits, quote, the selected primal vow, unquote, to us of the defiled world, colon. Return to this house of transmigration, of birth and death, is decidedly caused by doubt. Swift entrance into the sea of tranquility, the non-created, is necessarily brought about by Shinjin. Through their treatises and commentaries, these masters, all with the same mind, save the countless beings of utter defilement and evil. All people of the present, both monk and lay, should rely wholly on the teachings of these venerable masters. So, now, the stage is set for Shinran to evolve his own ultimate refinement of the teaching, that just one repetition, even the thought of Namo Amida Butsu in the context of Shinjin, or true entrusting, is sufficient to assure an individual that he or she will be reborn in Amida's pure land of bliss. And he himself humbly looked toward Honan, who transmitted, so to speak, quote, the selected primal vow, the 18th vow of Dharmakara, which gives us assurance that Amida's vow is true and real and can be the basis for our own salvation and ultimate enlightenment, as well as the basis for our return to this world to fulfill our compassionate impulses that we're totally incapable of perfectly fulfilling in the context of this human body and life. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.